We're in Luke's Gospel, chapter 16. Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do? Now that my master is taking the position away from me, I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I'm dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil.' He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat.' He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters. For a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." In recent years, at least, I'd say recent years, but probably at least over the last 25 years, we've seen a lot of spiritual leaders, people entrusted with shepherding others, fall. They have exploited the vulnerable, they protected their power, and they hid their abuse. That's not anything new. That's the unjust manager. That's the unjust steward. That's the rich man in this story. And it always breaks the heart of God. This parable of the unjust steward, or dishonest manager, as this translation has it worded, is one of the most difficult of Jesus' teachings to interpret. And there are a lot of different interpretations that have circulated over the years. I. Howard Marshall, in his commentary, notes that few passages in the gospel can give rise to so many different interpretations. And there's some merit and value to any of those interpretations. And what we've seen in our time together over the last few years is that there's a variety of ways to approach Scripture and still call it an interpretation. Some are better than others. There are a few popular interpretations about this parable. I'm just going to go over them briefly. One of the interpretations of this particular parable is that this unjust steward had acted unjustly throughout the story, wasting what did not belong to him, and then he cooked the books of those who owed the master in order to obtain their goodwill. And we see that played out in verse number 4. I'm going to go and make a deal with these people so that when my position's taken away because I'm not strong enough to beg, and I'm not strong enough to dig and I'm too proud to beg, they're going to welcome me into their homes. I'm going to work out a deal. Now, if that's true, then it's likely that the only thing the unjust steward may have done here is just eliminate their own profit by cutting out the interest that they were charging on these loans. Interest was illegal at the time. Another possible interpretation of the parable is that it is a discussion on the wise use of money. And with this interpretation, the steward is held up as kind of a model for disciples to imitate, given the master seemed to praise the unjust steward for acting shrewdly. And the idea here is that a follower of Jesus should use their wealth as wisely as possible. There's nothing wrong with that particular interpretation. There's some merit to that we should be wise stewards with our finances. Another possible interpretation is that this is just a way for us to understand how we should use our wealth to serve other people. That we can learn from the unjust steward to use our wealth and our privilege to serve the needs of the other people. After all, the unjust steward made some deals that actually benefited those who owed the master money. But that interpretation also requires us to see the manager as somebody who had acted corruptly throughout the story, all of a sudden is now moved by compassion instead of self-interest, right? The reality here is that the manager is cutting deals because it serves their own interest, right? They're hoping to gain the favor of those who are in debt. And this explains why Jesus commended the unjust steward for acting shrewdly in trying to secure a place for them after their position was gone. Each of these interpretations has some merit and value to them. I don't want to dismiss them all outright, but they're all equally problematic, because the assumption here is that this story is only about stewardship of money and not stewardship of the covenant. Some read it as a strange, disjointed parable on money. Make friends with unrighteous mammon. And there's certainly a theme there that you see played out in verses 9 through 13, but stopping there misses the larger literary and theological context. If you understand what a parable is, the word parable simply means to lay beside of. And the purpose of the parable is to compare and to contrast something. The parable of the unjust steward is not just about how to manage money, it is about how corrupt leadership has mismanaged grace and mismanaged the covenant. The unjust steward has been exposed as a corrupt leader, and he represents those who used their religious authority to control access to grace. And grace wasn't theirs to manage and gatekeep. Grace was God's gift to give. And this unjust manager had squandered what did not belong to him, and he's now being held accountable. We see that in verses 2 through 4. And the manager realizes that the books are about to be closed, and so he starts to look for a way out. And the manager says to himself, what am I going to do now? My master's taken my position away from me. I can't dig. I'm not strong enough for that, and I'm too proud to beg. It reminds me of that old Motown song. Ain't too proud to beg. Love that song. Dr. Craig Keener says that squandering a person's property then was considered a very despicable crime. And digging and begging were considered undignified professions, often only done by people who were slaves and didn't have any other skill sets. This parable is only about money to the extent that it spoke directly to the love of money by the Pharisees. And if you scroll down just one verse later into verse number 14, you see how this plays out. Verse number 14, I didn't read it this morning, but I will now. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all this, and they ridiculed him. Verse 14 gives us an indication that Jesus didn't suddenly decide to drop a random teaching about money out of the sky and how we should all do a better job of handling our household budgets. Contextually, that does not make any sense to the flow of Luke's gospel throughout. Consider a few things here about Luke's gospel in the way Jesus had just finished teaching a story about the parable of the wayward son, who also squandered his father's property with loose living. And that story moved from a lost son squandering his property to returning home and a celebration and rejoicing, while the elder brother, a metaphor for the religious leaders who had complained that Jesus welcomed sinners and ate supper with them, verse number 2 of chapter 15, it spoke to the elder brother, and it presented a challenge to the scribes and Pharisees who grumbled over the hospitality and table fellowship that Jesus had with outsiders. And it presented a challenge to them on, are you going to sit around and complain for the rest of your life, or are you going to come to the party and celebrate with the rest of us? For this son of mine was lost, and now he's found, and we're throwing a party. This is my party to throw. It makes no sense for Jesus to suddenly shift gears and all of a sudden go from talking about the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin and the wayward son. Okay, now I want to talk to you about money. It doesn't make any literary sense here. This is not an interruption for no particular reason. Throughout chapter 14, Jesus had been reiterating and reinforcing the spiritual and ethical nature of the kingdom of God by focusing on virtues like humility and hospitality and inclusion, and inviting the poor and those with no social capital to come to the table, people who couldn't do anything in return from them. And then he wrapped up chapter 14 by talking about the extraordinary cost of being a follower of Jesus and he transitioned there to respond to the criticisms of the scribes and the Pharisees who grumbled amongst themselves that Jesus welcomed sinners and had fellowship with them and ate dinner with them. This parable is really a story about corrupt leadership and the exploitative practices of the Pharisees, and it is in keeping with an Old Testament prophetic critique of the systemic institutional corruption of the religious leaders, who were in fact stewards of mercy and grace. Money in this parable is a metaphor for power and access and control. That's what money gives us in life. It gives us access to things. It is a form of power. It is a form of control. And in the ancient world, money wasn't just about having purchasing power. It was also about who gets to come in and who is forced to stay out. And Jesus is telling them here, you have been mismanaging the gate to God's grace, and your leadership is no longer wanted or needed. Now we're not talking about finances, we're talking about spiritual control, religious power. Who has access to the temple? Who's going to be included at the table? These are all major themes throughout the Gospel of Luke. Imagine a young adult whose parents left behind a trust, right? And this trust was to fund community projects and development in their hometown. They were going to build schools and food banks and clinics, but the trustee, the one managing the fund, decided to use it to build a mansion for themselves and live lavishly. That's the unjust steward. That's the rich man in the story. That's the Pharisees. And if we're not careful, it can be each of us, right? The prophetic critique has been resonating throughout Luke's gospel all along. Consider what Jesus said in Luke chapter 11, verse 52. You have taken away the key to knowledge. You didn't enter yourselves, and you hindered those who were entering. Or in Matthew's gospel, how Jesus said to the scribes and Pharisees, you shut up the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. The parable of the unjust steward fits Jesus' ongoing critique of the religious leadership of the time. They didn't own grace, but they acted like they were the landlords. They were behaving like bouncers at a party that they didn't throw, deciding who gets in and who gets out. Consider some of the broader themes in Luke's gospel. Mary's Magnificat prayer in Luke chapter 1, where she praised the God who lifted up the lowly and sent the rich away empty. Or in Luke chapter 4, how Jesus began by preaching good news to the poor and liberty for the captives. He opened the eyes of the blind and opened the ears of the deaf and touched the untouchables and healed the sick, and he raised the dead. And Jesus is constantly giving us this vision of a God who reverses the misfortunes of people who were suffering and excluded. And going a little bit further in Luke's gospel, we looked at this story a few weeks ago of the widow and her two mites. In Luke chapter 19, verse 46, and then again in chapter 20, verse 47, Jesus had told them that they'd turned the Father's house into a den of robbers and thieves, and he denounced the scribes and the Pharisees who devoured widows' homes. And then he was able to point to a living, real-time example of a woman who gave everything she had to a temple system that gave her absolutely nothing in return. No mercy, no forgiveness. And nobody stopped her from doing it. The religious leaders who were wearing their long flowing robes, they wanted all the seats of honor at the table, and they wanted public recognition. They consumed the most vulnerable people in society. And so I'm arguing that the parable is not about how we budget our finances better. It's about how religious establishments corrupted by power and money can block the blessings of grace from reaching the very people that God intended to receive them. Think about the entire temple economy run by the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They had monetized repentance, right? They controlled the prices of the sacrifices, leaving the poor and the desperately poor with nothing but empty hands and empty hearts. They controlled access to grace. They created these tiers of spiritual value. And as I think about that phrase, tiers of spiritual value, it reminds me of what I witnessed when I did mission work in India, of the caste system. And Christian churches And I wish the next story I'm going to tell you was made up. I wish it was false, but I lived it. Create a version of these tiers of spiritual value by giving records, right? I once worked as a dean of students at a Christian university, and during my tenure there, a male student had assaulted a female student, and I expelled the student from the university immediately. And I received immediate backlash because this student's family were millionaires. And they provided a lot of financial support to the denomination and the denomination's colleges and universities. There was no concern expressed for the victim or whether or not it was just to keep him on campus. They wanted to know if I'd be willing to work out some sort of arrangement to keep him as a student so that we didn't risk the financial gifts of this particular family. I wish that was a made-up story. But that's what happens when churches become corrupted by power and finances. This is one of many ways in which churches are very susceptible to creating those tiers, T-I-E-R-S, of spiritual values, not T-E-A-R-S, right? Although that's probably an appropriate way to look at it too. The interpretation I'm offering to you this morning is more of a prophetic critique, and it absolutely fits the rest of chapter 16, because after the scribes and the Pharisees ridiculed Jesus for his teaching on money, he tells the story of a rich man and Lazarus. And he's calling out a religious system that sold access to the sacred. And he's warning each of us here in this parable that if we treat grace like currency, we might end up displaced, like that manager, digging dirt, begging, and bankrupt in eternity. And what we learn about this unjust manager is the very inverse of the gospel. Grace was supposed to be freely given, but now it's being sold. Mercy was supposed to flow, but it's being managed. Forgiveness was to be announced, but it's actually being auctioned off. Who can afford those sacrifices? Certainly not the poor and the desperately poor. You might be wondering, okay, well, I can see that, but this whole thing seems disjointed, because what does marriage have to do with it? Because right there around verse number 18, Jesus introduces this random verse about marriage in the middle of a story about finances. The whole thing seems disjointed. None of it seems to make sense, right? Well, I'm going to tell you how verse number 18 fits with this interpretation I'm giving you this morning. In verse number 18, it says, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. Now, he inserts this verse here in the middle of a teaching about an unjust manager and stewardship and money. And as a response to the ridicule that he was receiving from the Pharisees who loved money, this particular verse just doesn't seem to fit. It seems to be disjointed, doesn't it? Well, on the surface, it does seem like a sudden shift. It seems like he's all of a sudden given this hard moral saying about divorce and adultery right in the middle of a broader discourse about stewardship and wealth and the Pharisees. But it's not random. And this is how it fits. Adultery in prophetic literature often symbolized spiritual unfaithfulness, especially idolatry and economic injustice. Think about the voice of Amos the prophet in Amos chapter 8, which I believe was one of the texts in the lectionary for this week. Amos crying out, "You have trampled the poor for a pair of sandals." Or think about the voice of Hosea or Jeremiah or Ezekiel 16 and Ezekiel chapter 23. Israel is constantly portrayed in the Old Testament prophetic literature as this unfaithful spouse because she's chased after gods of power and money. And so in chapter 16, Jesus might be subtly invoking this prophetic tradition, accusing the Pharisees of committing spiritual adultery, serving money and self-interest rather than God. And so inserting a statement on adultery and marriage in the middle of a teaching about being unjust managers is a reminder to all of us that God expects covenant faithfulness. And what did they do? Jesus said, "You justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts." God knows your hearts. So this isn't a budgeting parable, though we could probably learn something about managing finances here. This is a judgment parable. The religious elite, the people who had been entrusted with God's people, they were cooking the books. They were supposed to carry the weight of people's burdens, but instead they added more and then sent a bill. And you hear the prophets crying out, "You trample the poor." And you hear Jesus crying out saying, "You can't serve God and money." The problem wasn't that they had money, it's that money had them. The rich man at the end of chapter 16 here, he didn't wind up in Hades, or Hades, how Americans pronounce it. He didn't wind up there because he was rich. He was there because every single day of Lazarus's life, this rich man stepped over his suffering and didn't feel a thing. And now all of a sudden that the rich man is suffering, he wants the man that he ignored his entire life to go and dip his finger in a little bit of water and just cool his tongue. Get the irony here in the sense of entitlement. Right? Oh, well, if he can't do that because there's this great chasm, and then send him to my family. And Jesus says, they have Moses and the prophets, and they hadn't listened to them. They're not going to believe him, though a man raised from the dead. You had your warnings. You had Moses. You had the prophets. You had your warnings, and you ignored all of them. He's telling this story to us here about a dishonest manager, a story of a rich man who steps over the poor every day of his life. And he's saying, you had the prophets. You had the warnings, and you didn't listen, and I fear you're not going to listen, even if somebody were to rise from the dead. So I think it's important here to see that Jesus is not commending the unjust manager for suddenly acting shrewdly in beating the system. Jesus is pointing out just how enslaved and trapped he is by the system that he created. That's why he says, no servant, no slave can serve two masters. These people are enslaved to this corruption. He's saying essentially that you've spent your entire life in a corrupt religious economy and in a system that rewards power, appearance, and control. And you've used what was God's for yourself. And now the books are being audited and your stewardship is ending. You're scrambling, you're cutting deals, you're hoping the people you stepped over your entire life are going to suddenly welcome you when the money runs out, and it's going to run out. But what if the story isn't just about them? What if the story is about us? As we hear the story of the unjust steward, it's important to bring it home, right? Or else we think, well, at least I'm not them. But this is a timeless warning to all of us here that if we're not careful, it's a reminder that spiritual leaders, pastors, elders, churches, entire nations can become the unjust manager in this story. Jesus isn't giving us a TED talk on managing money. He's calling out a system that cloaks greed and neglect and injustice and religious piety in language. And so we ask ourselves this questions: how are we stewarding the gifts that God has entrusted to us? How are we using our power and the privileges that we have in our life to serve or protect other people? If Jesus were to walk through our church or walk through our city, where would he find the poor and those that have been ignored?